Hello, and thanks for joining us for another talk on one of the smaller Jewish communities that used to exist in the South Wales Valleys. We've been putting together a series of talks through the Jewish History Association of South Wales. My name's Laura Henley Harrison. I'm Project Officer for the Jewish History Association. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Jewish community in Brynmawr. So rather than focusing on online resources, I wanted to let the past Jewish residents of Brynmawr and their descendants tell you about their memories in their own words. Our oral history projects give us glimpses of these vanished communities. So the migration of Jewish people to Brynmawr was largely dependent on the industrial boom. Brynmawr saw the expansion of the coal industry in the later end of the 19th century, and the increase in workers to the mines led to an influx in those who played a supporting role within these communities. Those who ran businesses providing food, clothing, and household goods, which were usually the roles filled by Jewish immigrants arriving in the area from the mid-1800s onwards. It was often the case that these individuals arrived from the Russian Empire speaking no English or Welsh and with no financial safety net. Many started out as packmen, wandering through the valley towns with full packs on their backs, selling goods door to door. It was extremely rare for newly arrived Jewish immigrants to work in the mines, but this oral history with Mervyn Joseph shows that it did happen. And usually Mervyn's grandfather had emigrated to Wales from Palestine because he had had a brother living in Bargoed. This clip also highlights how difficult it can be to trace the Jewish population of these small towns based on surnames alone, as many anglicised their names upon arrival.
What was your grandfather's name?
His name was Samuel Joseph, but the Joseph actually wasn't originally his surname. It was Samuel Joseph McGollis, and again, it's only from what I heard, but apparently, when they were coming into this country, there were lots of problems in the way in which he was asked how to spell McGollis and he didn't know, and all sorts of things like that. So I think virtually when he came over, he simplified it to Samuel Joseph, and Joseph became the surname.
Okay. And he where was he born?
He was, to the best of my knowledge, he was born in what was then Palestine.
Right. So he came from Palestine too?
Yes.
Did he come to Cardiff then, or Brynmawr?
To Brynmawr, to the valleys, yes.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think he really knew where he was coming to. But there was a Jewish community then, lots of little Jewish communities in the valleys. His brother, that's my grandfather's brother, was in Bargoed.
Right.
And I know that he actually worked in the mines as a miner. And I think he was nicknamed Joseph the Red. I think for two reasons. One, that he had bright red hair, but I think he was a bit of a communist as well.
If business was stable, many were then able to open market stalls or small permanent shops in the town. Others would establish businesses in trades they had learned before their arrival, such as jewellers, tailors and glaziers. Although rare for early Jewish arrivals, there were two individuals recorded in Brynmawr who held more highly qualified jobs, a teacher and a chemist's apprentice. A recurring theme when speaking to the descendants of these early immigrants is the focus on education for the next generation. It was extremely rare for the children to continue in their father's line of work once the family had become more financially stable. However, occasionally there were exceptions to the rule when you add in an overprotective mother and competitive uncles.
Tell me about your father then.
My father was an important influence on my life. My mother was, but my father was, I would say, a greater influence. He was born in a place called Abertillery, which is up in the valleys, and in 1911, and he was the youngest, I think, of 8 children. His father died when he was 6 months old. So my father was born in July. His father, whose grave I will see, died in the December. a youngish man, probably middle-aged, 50s probably. Worked very hard. He was a glazier, used to cart glass on his back, you know, over mountains and whatever. So his eldest brother was about 19 years older than my father. So there were boys and girls and whatever. And they were already working down the mines, what have you. So my father was born in Abertillery in 1911. In 1914, apparently, so my father tells me, there was a knock on the door. First World War had started. Sorry, Mrs. Cammerman, because Mr. Cammerman was already dead. You have to move from here, because Abertillery is in Gwent, which is an industrial town, an industrial county. And you have to go up to a county that is considered to be rural, which was Breconshire. So they moved over a couple of days. Apparently they had a few days' notice. They had to move out of their little place, whatever it was, in Abertillery. My father did show it me once. It was down in the dip by the railway line there, up to Brynmawr. And so they moved to Brynmawr, to a couple of rooms somewhere. I don't know where they got it. So, you know, that was you can imagine, you know, got to move, got to go.
So your father would have been about what, about 3 then?
Three or four, yeah. And when he was 11, I think when he was 10 or 11, he had a peritonitis.
Right.
Now, in those days, it's a burst appendix. In those days, people mostly didn't live from one of those things. But the local hospital, Brynmawr County Hospital or whatever it was, they fixed him up. But my grandmother so doted on my father because she was the youngest. He was quite bright. You know, she didn't want him to go down the pit. She didn't want him to do work. She didn't want him to, you know, she cosseted him to the extent that she wouldn't send him to school even. So the school board people came, you know, a few times, and my grandmother said, no, my Cyril, the way she spoke English, I remember her slightly, is not going to school. Well, he has to go to school, Mrs. Cameron. He's not going to school. Anyway, it's happened for about 6 months, I'm told. And in the end, she relented, and he went to the local county school, which is like a grammar school, I suppose. And there, although they'd fixed his peritonitis up, he always had a very big scar and problems with his tummy around there. But there he excelled. And he was I think he was the first boy in the early 20s to go from Brynmawr to Cardiff University. And he studied history at Cardiff University. And every weekend he'd come home, help his mother in the shop. He'd go to Milford Haven to get fish and come up, you know, drive to Milford Haven, then come up to Brynmawr to bring her the fish for the weekend and whatever. And my uncle used to have a stall also on the market. My 2 uncles had stalls, and they used to pitch against each other, you know, all selling fruit and veg and fish. You don't want to buy from Cyril, that's my father. What does he know about potatoes? He's a university boy. They used to really, you know, put the knife in. Anyway, so then he went to Cardiff. He got a job teaching in Cardiff.
Another well-recorded Jewish profession was pawnbroking, although it has been noted that it was not as common in Brynmawr as in other Jewish settlements in South Wales. Jewish pawnbrokers were among the earliest Jewish arrivals in Brynmawr. It is believed from birth records that there were only 3 Jewish families in Brynmawr in the 1860s. Out of these, 2 were pawnbrokers, Solomon Bloom and Coleman Follick. In fact, 2 of the 4 men who leased the land for the establishment of a synagogue in Brynmawr were also pawnbrokers, Barnett Isaacs and Isaac Isaacs. It is interesting to note the close relationship the Jewish pawnbrokers had with the local police, as they were often the first port of call for those looking to offload stolen goods. Often the descriptions given by the pawnbrokers would lead to arrests. As with all of these small communities, it took time for the number of Jewish settlers to grow large enough to support their own synagogue. In order to establish an official community, there needed to be a group of 10 men aged 13 or over who could form what is called a minyan. Jewish law dictates there are a number of holy prayers which can only be recited if a minyan is present, which meant that large amounts of ritual worship were not possible for these early settlers unless they travelled to larger communities nearby. By the 1860s, more Jewish children were being registered as born in Brynmawr, but it was to be another 20 years before the first temporary synagogue was established. Up until this point, they would have travelled approximately 13 miles to the next closest community in Merthyr Tydfil on high holy days, and also to bury their dead in Merthyr Jewish Cemetery. Keeping in mind the hilly terrain, Welsh weather, and the fact that they could not use transport on the Sabbath, this was highly inconvenient and was often the major factor in keeping these small communities separate. In 1888, Barnet Isaacs provided the first temporary synagogue in Brynmawr. Barnet was born in Poland and was listed as a painter and glazier before he became a pawnbroker. Barnet's children were born in Brynmawr and he stayed there for the rest of his life, passing at 82 years old in 1918. Barnet allowed the Jewish community to use part of his home as a temporary synagogue, and he also met the cost of the adaptations for this. A nice story was published in the Jewish Chronicle in October 1889, which showed interactions between the Jews and the wider community in Brynmawr, as large numbers of Christians stood outside the temporary synagogue, listening in respectful silence to service on the eve of the Day of Atonement. Once the service had concluded, the non-Jewish listeners raised a sympathetic cheer. It was also nice to read in the Jewish Chronicle in October 1889 that Barnet Isaac's wife was formally addressed at a presentation in the temporary synagogue to thank her for placing a part of her home at the regular disposal of the Jewish community of Brynmawr. It is just a shame that she was not called by her first name in the article. However, today we have ancestry records and census documents which tell us that her first name was Ellen, who was also born in Poland like her husband. Sadly, Ellen did not live to see the construction of the synagogue in Brynmawr as she died in July 1891. Her obituary in the Jewish Chronicle interestingly credits Ellen as the founder of the Jewish congregation in Brynmawr, not her husband, and also noted her active role in cementing the excellent relationship between Jews and Christians in the town, and providing support to the sick and needy, regardless of their background. Large numbers of her Christian neighbours followed her body to the cemetery for burial, so it's about time we finally knew her name. So here we have Patricia Morris, who's recalling this sense of community cohesion in Brynmawr, especially when it came to kosher food.
One of the things that was remarkable in Brynmawr, of course, all these communities, they were very poor people, living hand from mouth. Came a time where they needed a Torah scroll for the community, and there wasn't one person or two or three people who could put the money together to write one. They're handwritten, they're expensive. So on the Atzei Chaim, the wooden supports for the Torah on which it's rolled, the names of all the people who contributed towards it are that, and there's about 30 or 40 names, and of course a lot of those names are very familiar, you know, so it's really an exercise in sentimentality whenever I've seen it, to look down, yes, I remember this one and I remember that one and I remember the other.
I'll ask you a bit more about Cardiff in a moment, but is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about Brynmawr or Cumbernauld or the valleys at all?
That I think they had a unique way of life there, that their wonderful relationships with their non-Jewish neighbours was possibly also at that time very unique. Each community had a respect for and admiration for the other, and the numerous stories of how they worked together. I mean, things like they had the young rabbis. Very often the rabbi in Brynmawr would be a young man who would sort of cut his teeth on one of these communities. And he was also responsible for the shechita, for the killing the animals. And they had the non-Jewish slaughtermen and men who worked with them and helped them. And if they had a very young rabbi who wasn't doing it properly, the slaughtermen would come to the heads of the community and say, look, you need to speak to Rabbi so-and-so. Not our place to do it, but you know he's making this mistake, and I'm not sure whether the meat is kosher.
Yeah. All right.
And they had with the kosher meat, there was once a week they slaughtered, and then the meat went, and that was it. There were no freezers in those days, so you had your meat and you had your bit of meat or your chicken for the Sabbath, and the rest of the week you probably didn't see meat.
Yeah.
But they had a separate counter in the ordinary butcher shop. And after the meat was finished, the people would come in and say to the butcher, "Have you got a bit of kosher left?"
Right.
Because they knew it was really fresh, it had been slaughtered that day.
Yeah, oh, I see, right, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So they wait until the Jews are gone and got their kosher and see if there was
Anything left, yes. It was a nice thing to find. The other thing is, my mother tells me that obviously no milk deliveries the way we had. I grew up to doorstep deliveries of milk and bread in the 40s and 50s. So, but what would happen is that the farmer would bring his cow into the central square, and everyone would come with their jugs or whatever containers and have the milk straight into the jug.
Yeah, so there was a lot of cooperation between the Jewish community and the local community.
Yes, yeah.
Barnett Isaacs was extremely involved in the community. His name is listed on the original lease of land to be used for the construction of a new synagogue, which was brought about by the Chief Rabbi's pastoral tour of South Wales in 1899. Chief Rabbi Adler felt that Brynmawr Jewry should quit their present inadequate and comfortless abode and erect a permanent structure. On the high festivals, as many as 120 Jews would crowd into the temporary prayer house, and occasionally they would also use the town hall for larger festivals. The worshippers would likely have been made up of Jews from Brynmawr and those who had travelled from smaller surrounding villages. The new building on Bailey Street was officially opened in June 1901. Attended by both the Jewish and non-Jewish community, with an address by the Chief Rabbi, who paid a graceful tribute to the Welsh people for their loyalty and love of country and language. Although the address itself was full of praise for the people of Wales, the correspondent for the Jewish Chronicle appears to feel less affinity for the landscape, describing Brynmawr as a windswept, bleak and cheerless little town. Here Anthony Morris recalls a visit to Brynmawr Synagogue with his grandfather for Passover.
My mother, for some reason or other, was in hospital, I don't know why, and I went to spend the Passover with my grandfather in Brynmawr. I remember going to the synagogue with him in the evening, and I remember that there were no electric lights there were gas lamps. And I remember people, when we came in, turning the gas lamps on and lighting them with matches or cigarette lighters, whatever. It was a small building, the synagogue. It's not there any longer. It's been knocked down and turned into a house. But I can describe it quite vividly, because there was the ark where the scrolls of the law were kept at one end. There was the reader's desk in the middle of the synagogue. Down the two sides were the rows of seats for the men, and at the back, raised up, was a women's gallery. But the scroll of the law was read from the central reader's desk, and I don't know if you've ever seen the inside of a scroll, but it's written in Hebrew without any vowels and without any punctuation, and the script is slightly different from the block script that we have in prayer books. But my father said that there were some women who used to stand upstairs in the ladies' gallery, and they could follow the reading from the scroll. They were that learned. Brynmawr had a very high percentage of population at one time. There was 2% of the population was Jewish, which is very high. The only towns anywhere near that were Leeds and Manchester. That was the only time I ever went to the synagogue when it was that I can remember when it was in active use. But I used to go to Brynmawr regularly to visit my grandfather.
The synagogue was not just a place of worship in these small provinces, but was also the centre of Jewish cultural life, which saw the formation of many clubs and groups, including a ladies' committee, a Jewish literary and social society, and the Brynmawr Zionist Association, which met fortnightly. So here we can see Brynmawr Synagogue today, and it's now a house. So as the community grew and flourished, the issue of a burial ground arose in 1919. This would overcome the difficulties with transporting the dead to Merthyr Tydfil. This clip from Anthony Hyatt's oral history describes the difficult conditions encountered by those travelling between these valleys towns.
So can you remember the synagogue? Can you describe the synagogue?
Oh, I can't remember that well. I do remember it was very small because we used to walk when you had to have a quorum of 10, and when all the people left just after the war, we used to walk then from Tredegar on the festival to the synagogue in Brynmawr, and also to Merthyr had a thriving community, and Brynmawr had one. But Tredegar, we never had a quorum there, so the synagogue more or less was let out as a shop, I think, then, and then it was made into a house when Michael Foote bought it. But I cannot remember, but I remember going to this, walking to Brynmawr 5 miles, and I can remember going to Brynmawr, nearly killed me, walking in on the evening of Kol Nidre, which is Yom Kippur, walking across Romney Bridge in the freezing cold with my grandfather and a gentleman called Abe Sherman of the football pools wouldn't let me go home and put me up the night in his home and took me back the next day by car because he wouldn't let me walk. I was only a little boy, about 7 or 8 years of age, and the weather was so... But my grandfather stayed in a pub somewhere and they wouldn't let me in. I do have very fond memories of that. Romney Bridge in the freezing cold.
It was decided at a meeting that this burial ground would serve Tredegar, Ebbw Vale and the New Bridge and District congregations, and a joint burial board committee was established. The land was gifted to the community by Mr. Abel Myers of Abersychan. The first interment took place in June of 1920. Anthony Morris here gives more of an insight into the reason why Abel Myers financed the burial ground.
Let's talk about the cemetery now then.
All right.
The cemetery is... Where's the cemetery?
The cemetery's on the top of the hill.
Yeah.
The joke in Brynmawr always was that's the nearest place some people are going to get to heaven. In the 1930s, there was a family Myers in Brynmawr, and Mr. Myers refused to belong to the burial society. And in those days, there wasn't a cemetery there. There was a cemetery in Merthyr. And what happened was when old man Myers died, they prepared the body for burial. They had to take it over the mountain by horse-drawn hearse. My grandfather suspected there was going to be trouble, so he took whatever money he had in his shop and begged and borrowed money from people around the area, got somebody to drive him quickly over to Merthyr. They got to the cemetery in Merthyr and the gates were closed. And the warden was standing outside and said, "I have orders not to open the gates unless I have £100, which in 1930s was a lot of money. But fortunately, my grandfather had the money. And as the hearse came up the hill to the cemetery, so they opened the gates. I don't know whether they dug the grave already or whether they still had to dig it. But anyway, afterwards, everybody was uproar about it. They went to Abel Myers, the son, and said, we want to raise money to buy a field of our own for a cemetery. Would you head the donors list? So he said no, and Abel Myers was quite a wealthy man. He said no, but I will match pound for pound what you can collect. And they raised sufficient money to buy this great big field at the top of the hill, top of Harcourt Road, Cemetery Road it was called in those days. It's now Harcourt Road. They consecrated only a tiny corner of it for the Jewish cemetery, and that's where the people were buried.
Just because the community now had a burial ground, there could still be complications due to the physical location of Brynmawr Cemetery. Kinder Transport refugee Henry Foner recalls the burials of his adopted parents.
Not really. It's I can't remember if the last time, if I remember, I've got to tell you that story just the same. Where Uncle Morris is buried, he's buried in Brynmawr. I think I've forgotten the name. Thing was, I told you that they got divorced. They didn't get divorced, sorry. They eloped. Mm-hmm. Because they never liked each other's families. But Auntie Winnie was her parents are buried in Brynmawr. And it was a big subject in her life where she should be buried. It was a point of great interest. So she bought gravestone places in Brynmawr Cemetery for her and Uncle Morris. So when he died, I remember I came to the funeral. He was lying there in a coffin with a Union Jack because he was an ex-serviceman. And they took him to Brynmawr and they buried him in Brynmawr. And when Auntie Winnie died, there was snow on the ground, which is unusual for Swansea. So you couldn't, and Brynmawr was up in the mountains. You couldn't get to Brynmawr. And so you have to be buried the same day. You can't hang around waiting. So they buried her in Swansea Cemetery next to his family. So the end of the story is that he's in Brynmawr with her family, who he can't stand, and she's in Swansea with his family, which she can't stand. So I suppose the moral of the story is you can't plan everything in life or in death. But you can go and see the gravestones.
And here we have Anthony Morris again describing the cemetery and the practices in Judaism relating to the burial of a death by suicide.
And that is the Jewish cemetery. The Jewish cemetery in Brynmawr is very unusual. It's one of the few cemeteries I've ever been to where all the graves face in the same way. Normally, you're supposed to bury somebody with its feet facing towards the east. But in a lot of cemeteries, they have to push them in where they can. But these all face, except for one, which is just inside the entrance on the right-hand side, which faces the other way.
Yeah.
The story of that one is that the lady who's buried there died in mysterious circumstances. Nobody actually wants to say she committed suicide, but she apparently asked her family for help, financial help, and they couldn't give it to her, wouldn't give it to her, and she ended her life. And therefore she was somebody who dies in those sort of circumstances. You bury in a corner of the cemetery facing the other way.
Here we have a slide just to illustrate what was said before. Here are the graves in Brynmawr all facing the same way. And here we have the possible suicide grave, which is quite a way away from the other graves and facing in the opposite direction. So as the community in Brynmawr declined, the burial ground became more and more difficult to maintain. Adrian Jacobs describes the solution reached for this problem.
So we've always looked after our own. We've looked after ourselves. We've made sure we were self-maintained. We looked after ourselves. Again, Brynmawr Cemetery. My apologies. They had a huge plot of land in Brynmawr. Once the demise of the community, it's now a very small cemetery. They came to arrangement with Brynmawr Council that they would give them all the excess land they had in a return that the Brynmawr Council would look after the Jewish cemetery. In perpetuity, and it's still there. As I said, my aunt and my uncle are buried there.
By all accounts, the Jewish community in Brynmawr saw a lot of internal conflict. There are numerous reports of fights in the Jewish Chronicle and local newspapers. These range from disturbing synagogue services to physical assault. Many of these cases resulted in court appearances, which is why they ended up in the newspapers. There were also religious disputes between rival factions of the Brynmawr congregation, and it was felt that this would tarnish the Jewish reputation among the wider community. The chief rabbi was even consulted to resolve an internal dispute in 1911. Here Anthony Morris describes for us what would happen.
We're talking about Brynmawr. Brynmawr is known as having two separate communities at one time.
Yes.
Is there anything?
I don't think it was two separate communities as such. What happened, there was one community in Brynmawr. There were two scrolls of the law in the synagogue. One belonged to the community and one belonged to the Brest family. And in any Jewish community, there's always bound to be an argument at some stage or other. And if there was an argument, they would get Old Man Brest onto the side of the opposition. He'd march into the synagogue, take out his scroll of the law, take it to somebody's house, and there'd be a separate service in that house for weeks, maybe months. And then the quarrel would be patched up, and they'd all be reunited again. But there was no separate community as such. It was just a break in the community for a short while.
Infighting was so prevalent in Brynmawr that a scathing article in the Jewish Chronicle actually coined the phrase Brynmawring to denote infighting within the Jewish communities. So quoting from the article, Brynmawring, it will mean a state of affairs in a Jewish place of worship where the members indulge in free fights during the service, where the most bitter hatred is nursed by member against member, where wrangles are carried out into the public courts of justice, where the house of God is turned into a cockpit, all for some silly reason. Thankfully, it does not appear that the infighting tarnished the Jewish reputation within the community. In fact, there were very few instances of reported anti-Semitism in Brynmawr. It was touched by the 1911 riots, which were at their worst in Tredegar. However, in Brynmawr, the Jews appear to have been protected by many of the townsfolk. The Chief Constable of Breconshire travelled to Brynmawr to make arrangements to adequately police the town, and although there were crowds in the streets, there were no signs of unrest. A mob of around 100 strangers appeared in the evening and tried to turn the people of Brynmawr against the police, but they refused. At 10 p.m, the strangers broke the windows of Mr. Cohen's jewellery store, but several civilians in the crowd intervened, and with the crowds cheering, the police arrested the two men responsible. Although the 1911 riots have become a subject of debate with regards to their anti-Semitic nature, it's unmistakable from contemporary reports that at the time the Jewish community in South Wales felt targeted. It's also widely reported that they felt that it was the citizens of the towns themselves who prevented a huge amount of looting and damage, showing the acceptance of the Jewish community within the wider Christian community of the Valley's towns. Anthony Morris's father was 3 years old at the time of the riots, and he shared his family anecdote with us.
My father was born in 1908 in Brynmawr, and he remembers the 1911 riot. He was only 3 at the time, but it had a deep impression on him. He said all the Jewish children were sent to out of their homes to the homes of the non-Jewish maids who used to come into the house to sleep for a couple of nights. He said he remembered all the shops in the village being boarded up, and remembers the soldiers being stationed in the marketplace, and the boundary between Monmouthshire, which is where Tredegar was, and Breconshire, where Brynmawr was an archway over the road. And he remembers that Sergeant Price, he remembered the name, was the officer who came down with the Chief Constable of Breconshire, and they stood on the boundary and said to the rioters as they came up the village, up the valley from Tredegar, that whilst you're that side of the bridge, I can't touch you because that's Monmouthshire, and I have no control over Monmouthshire. But as each of you comes over the boundary into Breconshire, I shall push you or knock you back again into Monmouthshire. And they stopped the riot as such on the boundary, and there was some damage, I think, in Brynmawr, but not as much as in Tredegar.
Another possible incident of anti-Semitism was the desecration of the Jewish cemetery in Brynmawr in 1972. However, it was widely believed that the vandalism was of a general nature and not specifically targeted at the Jewish population. This was because there were no anti-Jewish graffiti, and non-Jewish cemeteries in Brynmawr and Swansea had also been targeted. Patricia Morris speaks here about the good relationships between the Jews and the non-Jewish community in Brynmawr, and also touches on the beginnings of the community's decline and some of the reasons for this.
And when they were in Brynmawr, the jeweller's shop that my husband's grandfather used to have is still a jeweller's shop, right. And he's still got a clock on the wall that says J. Morris Jewellers. So we were in there and we were talking to him and reminiscing there, and my brother-in-law said they'd gone. There is a little museum in Brynmawr as well, which has a section on the Jewish life in Brynmawr, and they were there and they were looking around this, and somebody came up to them and said, what's your connection? And they explained it, and she said, I wish the Jewish people had never left Brynmawr. We we were so comfortable when they were here, and it's been
Yeah.
hard since then.
Yeah.
And asked why did they leave? And of course, I suppose it's the same reasons as, you know, the economy went down, there wasn't a living, the youngsters wanted to be in a centre where there were more people, you know, because in those days we wouldn't dream of thinking of marrying outside the faith. And there's a very high in marriage, you know, a very high proportion of the Welsh people married inside the faith at a time when there was a lot of people moving away. So there was a very great communal feeling and loyalty. But they didn't feel that separated them from their neighbours either.
The Brynmawr Jewish community was officially closed in 1963, as there were no longer enough members to form a minyan. The synagogue building was eventually converted into a house. If you would like to read more about the individuals who made up the Jewish community of Brynmawr, then Harold Pollins gives an excellent overview in his article, The Jewish Community of Brynmawr, Wales, which you can access freely online. He details community numbers, professions, and the various clergy who served the community over the years. So before I finish, I just wanted to introduce you to one more interesting character from the early history of the Jewish community in Brynmawr. J. Barnett Isaacs, not to be confused with Barnett Isaacs, who was co-founder of the synagogue. His obituary in July 1897 records him as a Brynmawr native who had been a special correspondent and war photographer with Black and White magazine in the Transvaal during the Boer War. He emigrated from Brynmawr to South Africa and established a successful photography business in Johannesburg. A few months before his death, he decided to return for a visit to Wales, which saw him sail around the east coast of Africa. Sadly, he sustained a ruptured blood vessel during the journey and died as the result of a seizure when he arrived home in Brynmawr. He was buried the next day in Merthyr Tydfil Jewish Cemetery. So that's the end of our talk today on Brynmawr. Thank you for joining us for that. I hope it's given you a little bit more insight into the stories of the community and also why we do the work that we do, especially gathering oral histories. So if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us about anything in the presentation, then here are our details. Thank you very much.